Hello, my name is Paul Gould, and I'm excited to be with you for the next 15 lectures as we talk about cultural apologetics. Now, I am a philosopher. I teach philosophy at a seminary. I write about philosophical topics in journals and in books, and I do my best to convince others that philosophy is important. But I struggle. Philosophy suffers from an image problem. There are some in our culture that think that philosophy in general and philosophers in particular provide no this worldly goods. Rather, we spend our time asking lots of silly questions like how many angels can fit on the head of a pin? You might have heard that one. Or questions like if you eat pasta and anti-pasta, would you still be hungry? Or questions like what was the best thing before sliced bread? In fact, even in the days of the golden era of philosophy, the days of Socrates and Plato themselves, philosophy and philosophers were made fun of. One of my favorite Greek comedies is by the ancient poet Aristophanes, and it's a comedy called The Clouds. And in this play, Socrates makes his appearance dressed in a silly robe, hanging in a basket, and he's contemplating the air, whatever that is, and he's asking questions like, how many times the length of its legs does a flea jump? You see, philosophy suffers from an image problem. And then there's the jokes. You hear about lawyer jokes, but there's actually philosopher jokes. And probably one of my favorite jokes, because it actually hits so close to home, was a joke I heard in graduate school. It was a joke about the difference between a pizza and a philosopher. It's not really a laugh out loud joke, but it's kind of a groaner. And so here it is. The question is, what's the difference between a pepperoni pizza and a philosopher? And the answer is one feeds a family of four. Yes, I know it's kind of a groaner, but it hits close to home. Now, the truth is that philosophy is actually extremely important. In fact, philosophy, the word is literally, it means the love of wisdom. Or as Plato puts it in the Republic, more scandalously, philosophers are wisdom's lovers. And it's true, as Colossians 2:3 says, that in Christ are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge. And so if that's the case, there's actually a really close connection between being a Christian and being a philosopher. In fact, all of us, and this might surprise you, all of us are philosophers, even if you don't get paid to be one. After all, every one of you have beliefs about God, about the world, about yourself. And in fact, you have no choice on whether or not you are a philosopher or a thinker. The only choice you have is whether or not you will be a good philosopher or a bad one. And so I want to help you in this course to be a good philosopher, to be a good thinker, to be a good cultural apologist. But I get ahead of myself. Like philosophy and philosophers, Christianity too has an image problem. While interest in religion has increased in the 21st century, culture in the West is largely becoming post or sub or anti-Christian. And along with this, the church has grown anti-intellectual and sensate, out of touch with the relevancy of Jesus and the gospel to all aspects of contemporary life. As a result, the gospel doesn't get a fair hearing. So the Christian voice has become muted. Add to this the fact that Christians often find themselves as fragmented as their non-Christian neighbors. We're marred by scandal, infighting, a lack of conviction, and so our prophetic voice is barely a whimper, and Christians historically have been called to exercise this prophetic voice. And so as a result, the Christian conscience has become muted. Still worse, Christians tend to look at the world pretty much the same as everyone else does. The world is viewed as ordinary, or mundane, or everyday. As the collective imagination of the culture is focused on the mundane, so too the Christian imagination has become muted. So these factors, the muting of the Christian voice, the conscience, and the imagination have diminished the prospect of having a genuine missionary encounter with others today. All too often, Christianity is relegated to the margins of culture, viewed as implausible or undesirable or both. Christianity, like philosophy, has an image problem. The question I want us to consider in this course is this: how can we work to renew the Christian voice, conscience, and imagination so that the gospel will get a fair hearing? Or, as the great missionary to India, Leslie Newbegin, put it on the first pages of his excellent book, Foolishness to the Greeks, he asked this question. He says, what would be involved in a genuine missionary encounter between the gospel and the whole way of perceiving, thinking, and living that we call modern Western culture? This is the crucial question, I think, that can be asked in a post-Christian culture. It's not the ultimate question, it's penultimate, right? The ultimate question for each of us is, what do you make of Jesus Christ? But Newbegin understood that the gospel is never proclaimed in a culture, and that every person we seek to reach is shaped by the collective mindset, the collective imagination, and the collective conscience of our culture. And this collective view informs whether or not the Christianity will be viewed as plausible or implausible, as a genuine possibility or an outrageous idea. So the crucial question before us, like Newbegin, is how can we have a genuine missionary encounter with the culture we find ourselves in? Now, we can do no better than to follow the lead of the Apostle Paul as he engages the Greeks in Athens. So for the rest of this session, we're going to look at the Apostle Paul as he arrives in Athens, and then we're going to consider our crucial question within his own context. And so we'll look at Acts chapter 17, verses 16 to 34, and we're going to make 6 observations along the way. And what will emerge from our exploration of this passage is a model of cultural apologetics, of how to embody the gospel in the midst of human culture. On his second missionary journey, after being run out of Thessalonica and Berea, the Apostle Paul finds himself in Athens to await the arrival of his companions Silas and Timothy. Now, I'll be reading out of the New International Version, beginning in Acts chapter 17, verse 16. Let's begin there. It says, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. And this leads to our first observation, and it's an observation about the Athenians as much as it is an observation about us. And here it is. The observation is that we worship that which is considered ultimate in our lives. Paul had ventured more than 1,000 miles from home, all the way to the most important city in all of Greece, to the home of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus and Zeno. These are important philosophers. It had produced famous playwrights such as Menander and then Aristophanes, who we shared about earlier, as well as important historians such as Thucydides. During Paul's time, the golden age of Athens had passed. As one commentator put it, Athens was in the late afternoon of her glory. In Paul's day, Corinth, where Paul is going to head next, had replaced Athens as the most important political and commercial center in Greece. Still, Athens was an important intellectual and culture center of the ancient world. It was the home to the very first university, Plato's Academy, and it was also an important religious center in the ancient world. In fact, one man who came to Athens at about the same time as Paul said this about the city. He said, it's easier to see a god or a goddess on the main streets than to meet a man. By Paul's time, estimates would say that there's somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 citizens, but about 30 to 40,000 idols that lined every street and building and marketplace in the city. And it's no different in our own day and age, is it? Everywhere you go, wherever you look, man has erected a god in which he worships. Of course, it might not be in the form of a statue, but we all worship that which we consider ultimate in our lives. I believe that we're led very naturally to worship that which is ultimate in our lives, and I was actually made aware of this universal thirst for worship, oddly enough, at a Pearl Jam concert in LA when I was in seminary. Now, I don't know if you know who Pearl Jam is. Just think 1990s grunge band. If you don't know what the 1990s grunge bands are, then just think really loud, sometimes obnoxious guitar, and you kind of get the idea. So I was living in LA a number of years ago. I was going to seminary, and my friend Mike and I went to this concert. And what I found was most amazing at the concert was after about 2 hours, as Pearl Jam gets on the stage, the entire auditorium begins to sort of move as a single organism to the rhythm of Pearl Jam. And about 2 hours in, I realized that we were engaged in basically the secular equivalent of a church worship service. And I can remember walking to my car that night, realizing that we all worship. There's this natural tendency of the human spirit to worship. And of course, that night we were worshiping at the altar of Pearl Jam. And of course, this makes sense, right? We've been created by God to respond to Him, to love Him, to worship Him, and to delight in Him, to enjoy Him. Thus, at our core, human life is inherently religious. All of human life is lived in response to God, either in communion or active or passive rebellion against God. All of us worship, and that which we consider ultimate in our lives. There's either the worship of the true God or idolatry. It's no wonder that Paul was greatly distressed, as we read in Acts chapter 17, verse 16, as he walked the streets of Athens and was confronted at every turn with lifeless idols. The Greek word here is one of intense anger. Paul's spirit was provoked within him because he understood that idolatry robs God of His glory. This intense anger spurred him to action. And so in verse 17, he begins to proclaim the gospel, as was his custom. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and then in the marketplace with the God-fearing Greeks. And as he shares the good news, as we read in verse 18 about Jesus and the resurrection in Athens, Paul encounters the philosophers of his day, the Stoics and the Epicureans, and it basically evokes two reactions from his listeners. First, some think that he is a babbler in verse 18. Literally, this word is interesting. It means a seed picker. It's a word that evokes the image of a bird that's pecking indiscriminately at seeds in a barnyard. And the idea was that Paul was a kind of dilettante, someone who picks up a scrap or an idea of wisdom here and another idea here, and he passes it off as profundity. So that was the first group. The second group thought that he was teaching about foreign deities. And you see, the philosophers misunderstood Paul to be actually proclaiming two gods. They thought he was teaching about a god named Jesus and a goddess named Anastasis, which is the Greek word here for resurrection. Paul was creating such a stir that they took him and they invited him to speak at the Areopagus in verse 19. Now, the Areopagus is the ruling body for the city of Athens. It's also a place, it's a hill in Athens, and this is the ruling council who 400 years ago condemned Socrates to death for corrupting the youth and for introducing false gods. And so Paul begins his speech to the men of Athens in verse 22. Let's read verses 22 and 23. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and I looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship is something unknown I'm going to proclaim to you." This leads to our second observation. I want you to notice that Paul was a student of the culture he sought to reach with the gospel. There's a phrase in verse 23, this phrase, "looked carefully," means looking at something again and again, examining it meticulously. In other words, Paul didn't simply happen across these altars, he went looking for them. He did his homework. And what he discovered was all over the city, there were altars to an unknown God. Now, he also would have learned that during a deadly plague that hit the city of Athens about 500 years ago, before he was there, it wiped out about a third of the population. And the people of Athens sought to appease the gods that they knew by name, offering sacrifices one after another to God after God. But no matter who they sacrificed to, the plague wouldn't stop. Finally, one of their teachers, a poet named Epimenides, said, "Why don't you make an altar to an unknown God and offer sacrifices to it?" And so they did. And the plague stops. And so, all over the city, they have these idols to this unknown God. You see, Paul did his homework. He took his time to understand the culture so that the gospel would get a fair hearing. And this observation is important, right? It points to the character of the messenger. Paul was intellectually and morally virtuous. He was provoked rightly in the face of idolatry, so he was morally virtuous. And then he was compelled by the love of Christ to take the time to study, to understand, and to see things from the perspective of another. So he was intellectually virtuous as well. Now, this leads to some uncomfortable questions, I think, for us. Could it be that part of the reason why Christianity is so maligned and misunderstood in our culture is that we've just not taken the time, paradoxically, to understand those we seek to reach? Or worse, that Christianity is so maligned and misunderstood because we aren't the kinds of people God wants us to be. And a prominent reason for this, and I'm just going to be frank here, is our anti-intellectualism and laziness. All too often, as Christians, we become intellectually shallow and theologically illiterate. And so we've lost our voice and we've withdrawn from culture, carving out a space for faith as private or subjective. But this is anti-intellectualism, and it's a scandal. It's a sin. It's actually unbiblical. Paul reasoned with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks. He looked carefully at the culture he sought to reach, and so must we. All right, let's get back to our text. Our third observation, and actually our first regarding the actual speech that Paul gives, is this. And I'm going to use some language from the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright here that I think helps unpack what Paul's doing in this speech. So the third observation, the first one about the speech is this, that Paul affirms what he can affirm in the Athenian culture. Paul affirms the religious nature of the Athenians. Even in their idolatry, he recognizes their attempt to grope after God. And so he identifies a common ground as a starting point from which to build a bridge to the gospel. And we'll see how he does this in a minute. But he says, in effect, let me tell you the true nature of this God whom you worship and do not know. Let me tell you about this God whom you worship as unknown and who heals the plague. This is the God I'm going to proclaim to you. And so he begins to do that in his speech. And let's move to our next observation. So Paul affirms what he can affirm in the Athenian culture, and so should we as we begin to build bridges from our Athens to the gospel. Our next observation, and then our second from the speech, but our fourth overall, is that Paul outflanks their thinking. Now watch how he does this. He does this in a brilliant way, okay? Watch what he does. He begins now in verse 24. He says, this God whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague, is the true God. He says, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by hands. So this God whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague, is your creator. But he's not just your creator. This God is also your sustainer. Look at the next verse, verse 25. And he is not served by human hands, as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. So this God whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague, is your creator, and he's your sustainer. But he's also your ordainer. Look at verse 26. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact place where they should live. So Paul has this reference here in verse 26, from one man. He's referring to Adam. And the idea here is that he wants them to see that they are from one common source. So this God whom you worship is unknown, who heals the plague, is your creator and your sustainer and your ordainer. And because of that, for that reason, he says in verse 27, you should seek him. Look at verse 27. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. Now here we find Paul's theology of general revelation. God has revealed himself through that which he has made so that we would seek him. This is why God did this. Paul uses this word here, reach out or feel after God and find him, and it's the same word that the Greek poet Homer used in the well-known story of the Cyclops, which you can read in Homer's Odyssey. In Homer's tale, we have this giant one-eyed Cyclops, this monster, who's captured Odysseus and his men. And of course, Odysseus and his men want to escape, and so they devise this plan. They get him drunk, and they spear this one-eyed monster, this Cyclops, and blind him. And during that moment, as the Cyclops is blinded, he's groping about in the dark, trying to find Odysseus so that he might kill him. And this is the very same word that Paul uses. So it's as if Paul is saying, in your sin, we are as blind as the blinded Cyclops. Nevertheless, because creation is still here, we have an obligation to feel after God, to grope after God and to find him, even as we can't see him. And next we arrive in verse 28 to one of my favorite passages, a passage that shows Paul's brilliance. Now, in order to see what Paul is doing here, we need to know just a little philosophy. And I promise I won't do a lot, but we need to do a little here. And so we need to understand that since the beginning of Greek philosophy, there were three central questions that captured the imagination of man. And here was the three questions. The first is this: what is being? In other words, what is the nature of reality? The second question, what is life? Third question, what is motion? Or in other words, how do we account for change? Now, the early philosophers gave differing answers to these three questions. The very first philosopher, a guy named Thales, he said, hey, all is water. So what is being? It's water. And that's actually not a bad first pass if you think about it. You know, he's staring out in the Mediterranean Sea, he's looking at rivers. And so what is being? What is reality? It's water. What is life? Well, things that have water. What is motion? Well, it's water. It's not a bad first pass. But then, as you can imagine, the next philosopher comes around. The next philosopher was a guy named Heraclitus. He says, no, it's not water that is the fundamental nature of being. Heraclitus says that all of reality is changing. Everything is changing, and that's the most fundamental nature of reality. So Heraclitus famously said, you can't step in the same river twice. All is change. And so Heraclitus answered those three questions in light of change. But then the next philosopher comes around, a guy named Parmenides, and he says, no, it's not change that's the most fundamental nature of reality, but it's unchange. All reality is unchanging and static and eternal. And so Parmenides would answer his three basic questions in light of unchange. And you can kind of see how this dialectic would continue all the way through Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, all the way down to the time of Paul. And then we read in verse 28, where Paul says this: in him we live and move and have our being. Paul was in effect saying, you know those fundamental questions that you've been asking since the beginning of Greek philosophy? Let me tell you the answer. It's God. It's this God whom I proclaim to you, whom you worship as unknown, who heals the plague, who is your creator and sustainer and ordainer. He's the answer to your questions. It's in him that we find life. It's in him that we find movement. It's in him that we find being. You see, Paul had done his homework, and he had outflanked his opposition. Now, it's important to note that Paul is quoting from the philosophers and the poets of his day. In verse 28, the first quote, in him we live and move and have our being, is likely from a pagan poet, Epimenides, who is speaking of the god Zeus. So Paul cites the poet, and then he reinvests the idea with fresh meaning, arguing that the poets were right to a certain point, looking to their God for life and being and motion, but that they misidentified the true nature of God. The next part of verse 28, where he says, as some of your poets have said, we are his offspring, this is the Stoic philosopher Aratus. So I want you to notice that Paul is effortlessly quoting from the popular artists and poets and novelists of our day. It would be like me quoting from Pearl Jam in order to make a point. That is what Paul is doing as he outflanks his opposition. Okay, our next observation, our fifth observation, our third observation from the speech is this. I want you to notice that Paul confronts the rank idolatry in their midst. Beginning in verse 29 of Acts chapter 17, Paul breaks the conversation out of the orbit of the Greek world that was familiar to his listeners and begins to move the gravity of the discussion to a distinctly biblical worldview and orbit around there. So let's look at verse 29 through 32. Paul says, therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, But now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. Now, having affirmed the spiritual hunger behind the abundance of idols, Paul now teaches that their idols are inconsistent with belief in a personal creator God. He says looking anywhere else short of God to meet your needs is idolatry, and it's an empty pursuit. And so he introduces them to the idea of moral wrongdoing about which their own philosophies are quite fuzzy, and this idea of accountability to a God for their behavior. And he challenges them to repent, to literally change their mind, to abandon one worldview and to embrace another. And then finally, he introduces the one who stands at the center of the Christian faith, Jesus Christ, who rose from the dead, a claim that stands at direct odds with the tradition of the Athenians. Now, here's an interesting historical point. There is a kind of Greek mindset that informed the founding of the Areopagus. And if you read the Greek poet Aeschylus and his Oresteia trilogy, you'll read of the mythic founding of the Areopagus. And in this poem, you read of a speech that was given by the god Apollo, who is basically defending himself in front of a jury. It's a group of these three furies. And during this defense that Apollo is given, he says this. He said, "Once a man is slain, once blood is shed, there is no resurrection." Now, perhaps Paul knew about this Greek tragedy and the mythic founding of the Areopagus that formed the background of the Greek mindset. And then he stands before them and he says, if there was no resurrection, well then tell me, who was that I was talking to on the road to Damascus? You see, Paul had built a bridge to the gospel. He started with the unknown God. He proclaimed the truth of God as he effortlessly quoted from their own pagan poets and philosophers, and he brings them into the orbit of the gospel and Jesus. He had had a successful missionary encounter with the whole way of perceiving and thinking and living that was his Athens. He brought his listeners to the ultimate question: what are you to make of Jesus Christ? This leads to our last observation. Observation number 6. Paul's speech had mixed responses. So let's finish the passage. Let's read verses 32 to 34. Beginning in verse 32. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them were Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So here we have 3 basic responses to Paul's speech. Some sneered and mocked, some wanted to hear more, and some believed. Now the question that immediately comes to mind is, why did Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, why did he include this mixed response in the text? Does it show that Paul's speech was a failure, as some commentators think? Well, I don't think so. But it does leave us with 2 important points to remember when we share the gospel with others. The first is this. If Paul had mixed responses when he shared the gospel, well, they'll probably be with us as well, right? There'll be mixed response. Some will believe, some will reject Christ, and some will want to hear more. Our job is to faithfully present the gospel in a way that can be understood by those in our culture, so that they can see that the central question is, what will they do with Christ? It's the Holy Spirit's job to convict them of their sin, to bring them to faith, and it's not ours. Our job is to be a faithful witness. Now, the second thing that I want us to notice from Luke's recording the mixed results is that it's a reminder that there's actually another question that's even more fundamental than this ultimate question. Remember, I said the ultimate question that we want everybody to ask is, what do you make of Jesus Christ? But there's actually a more fundamental question than that. It's a question that C.S. Lewis reminds us of, and that's the question, what does Jesus Christ make of us? And here we need to be reminded that the answer is one of love and pursuit, that he thinks a great deal of us, so much so that he's given himself on the cross so that we might find hope and life and meaning and significance, not in the things of this world, but in the gospel and in Jesus Christ, who gives us our identity. So the mixed response to Paul's speech at Athens reminds us that we are aliens in a fallen world, called by God to be faithful witnesses for Christ in a world that desperately needs him. Now, Paul's method in Athens is instructive for us. He understood the culture, and he employed his knowledge in order to identify a starting point from which to build a bridge to Jesus and the gospel. In our next session, we'll develop a Pauline-inspired model of cultural engagement by following Paul's lead in doing three things. First, we'll consider our own Athens. And then we'll consider what kind of bridges can we build between our Athens and Jesus and the gospel. And finally, we'll consider the kinds of obstacles that must be addressed as we build a bridge to the gospel along the way.